George Dewey was born December 26, 1837, Montpelier, Vermont, United States, and he died January 16, 1917, in Washington, D.C. He was a United States naval commander who defeated the Spanish at the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. He graduated at the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, and in 1858, George Dewey was commissioned a lieutenant 3 years later. In the United States Civil War, 1861 to 1865, he served with Union naval forces in the Battle of New Orleans in 1862 and Port Hudson and Donaldsonville in 1863. In 1864 through 1865, he served at the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. After receiving periodic promotions, Dewey assigned 1897 at his own request to the U.S. Assistic Squadron. Anticipating war with Spain, he undertook an intense study of the Spanish-owned Philippine Islands and prepared his fleet for battle. When war did break out on April 1898, he sailed from Hong Kong to the Philippines, and on the evening of April 30th, his squadron entered Manila Bay, where the Spanish was anchored near Cavite Island. Dewey, with his 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats in line, opened fire the following morning shortly before 6 a.m. with the now famous command, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." American naval gunfire had sunk or destroyed most of the Spanish warships by the time the squadron withdrew about 7:35 a.m. The American ships resumed the action a few hours later to reduce the remaining Spanish ships and the shore batteries around Cavite. The Spaniards offered little effective resistance, and Dewey was able to defeat them without the loss of a single man. His victory resulted to the acquisition of the Philippines by the United States and signaled the expansion of that country's power into the Western Pacific. Nellie Bly was a journalist. She was born on May 5, 1864, in Cochran's Mill, Pennsylvania. She passed away on January 27, 1922, in New York, New York. She was known for traveling around the world in 72 days and did research on mental institutions. Her real name is Elizabeth Jane Coach Rainbow. When she started writing, she decided to go by Nellie Bly. In order for her to get into an asylum, she had to pretend to be crazy. She wrote about the horrible treatment and conditions in the institutions. Nellie wrote about the poor treatment of women for several years. Nellie married a guy named Robert Seaman in 1895. When he passed away, Nellie took over his company. Nellie Bly died on January 27, 1922, at the age 57 from pneumonia. She was buried in the Bronx. She was the first woman to report from the Eastern Front during the Second War. She eventually had to flee the country after the government got upset with one of her articles. Nellie's trips took her to England, France, Yemen, Ceylon, Singapore, Japan, and when she reached San Francisco, she became 2 days behind schedule. The Spanish-American War was fought between the United States and Spain in 1898. The war was fought largely over the independence of Cuba. Major battles took place in the Spanish colonies of Cuba and the Philippines. The war started on April 25, 1898, when the United States declared war on Spain. The fighting ended with a U.S. victory 3.5 months later on August 12, 1898. Cuban revolutionaries have been fighting for the independence of Cuba for many years. They first fought the 10 Years' War between 1868 and 1870. In 1895, Cuban rebels rose up again under the leadership of Jose Marti, and many Americans supported the cause of the Cuban rebels and wanted the United States to intervene. When conditions in Cuba got worse in 1898, President William McKinley sent the U.S. battleship Maine to Cuba to help protect American citizens and interests in Cuba. On February 15, 1898, a huge explosion caused the Maine to sink in Havana Harbor. Although no one was sure exactly what caused the explosion, many Americans blamed Spain. They wanted to go to war. President McKinley resisted going to war for a few months, but eventually public pressure to act became too great. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, and the Spanish-American War had begun. Rutherford B. Hayes was born on October 4, 1822, in Delaware, Ohio, United States. He died on January 17, 1893, in Fremont, Ohio. He was the 19th President of the United States from 1877 to 1881. He brought post-Civil War Reconstruction to an end in the South and who tried to establish new standards of official integrity after 8 years of corruption in Washington, D.C. He was the only president to hold office by decision of an extraordinary commission of the congressmen and Supreme Court justices appointed to rule on contested electoral ballots. Hayes was a son of... After graduating from Kenyon College at the head of his class in 1842, Hayes studied law at Harvard, where he took a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1845. Returning to Ohio, he established a successful legal practice in Cincinnati, where he represented defendants in several fugitive slave cases and became associated with the newly formed Republican Party in 1852. He married Lucy Ware Webb, a cultured and unusually well-educated woman for her time. After combat service with the Union Army, he was elected to Congress in 1865 through 1867, and then to the Ohio governorship in 1868 through 1876. Chief Joseph was the chief of the Nez Perce tribe. He was born on March 3, 1840, in the Wallowa Valley, Oregon. He died September 21, 1904, at the Colville Indian Reservation, Washington. He was best known for leading the Nez Perce into the Nez Perce War. Chief Joseph was born a member of the Nez Perce tribe in Wallowa Valley, Oregon, in 1840. His Nez Perce name meant thunder rolling down the mountain. Young Joseph was the son of Joseph the Elder, the local chief. He grew up close friends with his brother Oclocott. He learned how to ride horses, hunt, and fish at a young age. When he was a young boy, settlers from the United States began move into the land of the Nez Perce in 1955. His father came to an agreement with the governor of Washington as to which land would remain Nez Perce land, and there was space between the Nez Perce and the settlers for several years. In the early 1800s, gold was discovered on the Nez Perce land. The U.S. government wanted the land and demanded that the Nez Perce agree to a new deal. In 1863, they told the Nez Perce to move out of Wallowa Valley and into Idaho. Chief Joseph refused to let that happen. He felt the governor had lied to him when he made the first agreement. In 1871, Chief Joseph the Elder died, and young Joseph became chief. Before his father died, Joseph promised that he would not sell the land of the Wallowa Valley. Joseph did everything he could to keep the peace with the settlers. However, in 1877, one of the other Nez Perce bands got into a fight and killed several white settlers. He knew peace had to come to an end. Theodore Roosevelt.
He was born October 27, 1858. He grew up in New York City and was the second child of 4 children. He traveled widely with his parents through Europe and the Middle East in the 1860s. He enrolled in Columbia Law School but dropped out after his first year to begin a career in public services. Roosevelt wrote a number of books during this period. Roosevelt also campaigned for Republican president nominee Benjamin Harrison. Roosevelt was then appointed to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. When the Spanish-American War began, Roosevelt volunteered for service as a commander. When he returned home, a war hero, he decided to run for governor. In 1901, President McKinley was shot dead, and Roosevelt, his vice president, had to step up. Roosevelt then served as the 26th President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. He became president when he was 42 and remains the youngest person to become president in the United States. Roosevelt is the most famous for his domestic program, Square Deal, which had 3 basic ideas known as the 3 C's: conservation of natural resources, control of the corporations, and consumer protection. April 12, 1945, Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt had a stroke and died at the age of 60. Battle of the Little Bighorn. It started June 25, 1876 and ended June 26, 1876. It's also referred to as Custer's Last Stand, known to the Plain Indians as the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The battle was between the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the U.S. Army and several Native American tribes. Native American tribes that were included in this battle were Lakota, Cheyenne, Dakota, and Arapaho. The battle took place because the U.S. government went back on the treaty to guarantee the Black Hills in South Dakota to Lakota. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, and the U.S. government decided they wanted the land back. George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry of 700 men into the battle. Custer was then killed in the battle. It took less than an hour for Custer and his troops to be wiped out by the Native Americans. The Native American tribe leaders present at the battle were Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Chief Gal. This battle triggered more debate and conjecture than any other battle in the U.S. history. The U.S. stood to their ground and were defeated by the Native Americans. Despite the Native Americans' victory for this battle, reinforcements were later sent out to drive the Native Americans out of the Black Hills. Susan B. Anthony. She was an American social reformer and women's rights activist. She was born February 15, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She was born into a Quaker family committed to social equality. She collected anti-slavery petitions at the age of 17. She was a teacher for 15 years, and she joined the women's suffrage movement in 1852. In 1863, she organized a Women's National Loyal League to support the petition for the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery. She campaigned for full citizenship for women and people of every race and color in the 14th and 15th Amendments. In 1868, she began publishing her own newspaper in Rochester called The Revolution to continue her campaigning. In 1872, Anthony, her 3 sisters, and other women were arrested for voting in Rochester. In 1877, she gathered petitions from the 26 states with 10,000 signatures, and Congress laughed at them. In 1887, the women's suffrage organizations merged as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In the 1890s, Anthony raised $50,000 in pledges to ensure the admittance of women to the University of Rochester. In 1900s, she persuaded the University of Rochester to admit women. In 1906, she died in her home in Rochester at the age of 86. Helen Hunt Jackson, an American poet and writer who became an activist on behalf of Native Americans. Born on October 15, 1830, grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, and was a daughter of a professor at the Amherst M.A. College. She attended Ipswich Female Seminary and Abbott Institute. At the age of 22, Helen married her first husband, Edward Bissell Hunt. Her first husband and 2 sons died during a war in 1863. After they died, she turned to writing. In 1875, she married William Jackson and moved to Colorado. Her and her new husband made occasional trips back to New England. Helen's literary efforts were devoted to children's books, travel sketches, and poetry. Many of her work appeared in the New York Independent. On a trip back to East in 1879, she attended a lecture in Boston by the Ponca chief. This sparked her interest in improving rights for the Native Americans. She promised to raise funds for the Ponca people so they could return to their homeland. She exposed the government's violation of treaties with the Indian tribes, and in 1881 she wrote her most important book, A Century of Dishonor. She died from a stomach cancer on August 12, 1885 in San Francisco, California. Robert La Follette, born on June 14, 1855 in Prime Rose, Wisconsin. He was an American Republican, and at the age of 19 he left home to attend the University of Wisconsin. At the University of Wisconsin he studied law. After college he became a practicing attorney. He married Bella Case in 1881. Robert and his wife Bella had 4 kids. After 4 years of being a district attorney, he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1885. He worked for political reform as a representative. Most of his time as a representative, he was thinking about fixing the government and defending the people he represented in Wisconsin. He held a position as governor of Wisconsin from 1901 to 1906. He decided on serving another term as governor to become one of Wisconsin's 2 senators. He worked tirelessly for government reform as a senator. Robert was not only U.S. representative and governor, but an anti-war activist, women's rights activist, and civil rights activist. He ran for president of the United States in 1924. He died on June 18, 1925, in Washington, D.C. at the age of 75.
Alfred T. Mahan was born on September 27, 1840. He was the son of a professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1859. He then went on to serve nearly 40 years of active duty in the U.S. Navy. He then fought in the Civil War. After the Civil War, he later served on a staff of Admiral J.A.B. and progressed steadily in rank. In 1884, he was invited by Stephen Luce, president of the newly established Naval War College at Newport, to lecture on naval history and tactics there. He then became the college's president in 1886 and held that post until 1889. In 1890, he published his college lectures. The book, which came at a time of great technological improvement in warships, won immediate recognition abroad. His book, The Influence of Sea Upon History, won immediate recognition and made him world famous. He then retired from the U.S. Navy in 1896, but after retiring from the Navy, he was recalled to service. He served as president of the American Historical Association in 1902. Before his death, he correctly foretold the defeat of Central Powers and of German Navy in World War I. In 1914, he then died on December 1st in Washington, D.C. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735 in Quincy, Massachusetts. After graduating in 1755 at age 20, Adams studied law in the office. He quickly became identified with the Patriot because he didn't agree with the Stamp Act in 1765. In 1774, he was elected to the Massachusetts Assembly, and then in May 1776, Congress approved Adams' resolution proposing that the colonies each adopt independent governments. On May 15, 1776, he took part in one of the most important documents ever created, which was the DOC. In 1779, Adams was one of the American diplomats sent to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, which brought an end to the Revolutionary War. In 1789, he was placed on the ballot for America's first presidential election. In 1796, he became the president of the U.S. During his presidency, a war between the French and British broke out. By the 1800s, this undeclared war had ended, but Adams was very less popular than when he won his presidency back in 1796. Therefore, he lost the compatibility for presidency in the 1800s. On October 25, 1764, 5 days before his 29th birthday, Adams married Abigail Smith, his third cousin. After his presidency, Adams lived quietly with Abigail on their family farm in Quincy. He continued to write and to correspond with his friend Thomas Jefferson when he moved to their family farm. Adams then died on July 4th in 1826. The Explosion of Maine was a second-class battleship commissioned in 1895. In 1895, it was part of the new U.S. naval fleet of steel ships. The USS Maine was in Cuba, officially on a mission of friendly courtesy and incidentally to protect American lives and protect in the event that Cuba's struggle for independence from Spain might escalate into full-blown warfare. It exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898. This happened on 9:40 p.m. on the night of February 15, 1898. The Maine was riding quietly at anchor in Havana Harbor the night before the explosion, killing 260 of the fewer than 400 American crew members aboard. In the morning of the explosion, only twisted parts of the huge warship superstructure could be seen protruding above the water. The Maine had been showing the flag in Cuba, where the Spanish regime was resisting an armed uprising by nationalist guerrillas. The Maine weighed more than 6,000 tons and was built at the cost of more than $2 million. The Maine was sent to Cuba to protect the interests of Americans there after a rebellion against Spanish rule broke out in the Havana in January. Official U.S. Naval Court inquiry ruled in March when the ship was blown up by a mine. In 1876, a team of American naval investigators concluded that the Maine explosion was likely caused by a fire that ignited its ammunition stocks. On April 25, 1898, Congress formally declared war on Spain. Queen Lulukalani was born on September 2nd in 1838 in Honolulu. She was the daughter of high-ranking chief Cesar Kapa'akea and Analia. In 1862, on September 16th, Kalani married John O'Dommons. In 1891, her brother King Kalakaua died, and Kalani succeeded to the throne. The Queen yielded her throne on January 17, 1893, and a provisional government was established. In 1895, Kalani was imprisoned for 8 months in Lani Palace for her alleged knowledge of a counter-revolutionary attempt by her supporter. On May 18, 1896, at 6:30 a.m., Kalani was baptized and confirmed by Bishop Willis into the Apostolic Church. She was a gifted songwriter and wrote more than 160 songs during her life. She never had any children of her own, but since her husband wanted some, they adopted 3 children. In her youth, she was called Lydia or Little U, and then Lulukalani when she became heir apparent. The color of her reign was yellow, and she was granted a small pension by the provisional government, and on July 7, 1898, the Hawaiian Islands were officially annexed by the U.S. She died from complications related to a stroke on November 11, 1917, at age 79. After her state funeral, her remains were placed in the Royal Mausoleum. Kate Richards O'Hare was born on March 26, 1876, in Kansas. Her parents were Andrew and Lucy Sullivan. She graduated from Central High School in Kansas City. At the age of 11, Kate moved from the wide-open prairie to the gritty slums of Kansas City's West Bottoms. She was an American editor and joined the Socialist Party in 1899. In 1917, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison in North Dakota. While in prison, she wrote 2 books called Kate O'Hare's Prison Letters and In Prison. She taught for a short time at a rural school, and she was the most influential political female of her generation. She was unsuccessful at running as a candidate for the U.S. Congress in Kansas on the Socialist ticket in 1910. In 1922, she organized the Children's Crusade. In 1934, she helped Upton Sinclair in his social campaign to become the governor of California. After teaching, she then became an apprentice machinist in Kansas City, Missouri. On January 10, 1945, Kate Richards O'Hare died.
The Red Scare was the fear of the Communist Revolution. Started in the 1920s. It was the worst. It was very worse in 1940s through 1950s. It was a huge hysteria. Communists were referred to as the Reds. Communists had an alliance to the Red Soviet flag. It led up to the Palmer raids. There's a lot of embolitions. It led to 40 people killed. Mobs attacked any suspects. Palmer raids lasted through 1919 through 1920. It led to the conviction of Nicholas Oska. In New York, thousands of people protested. Many self-proclaimed. Amongst them were mailed bombs. 4,000 suspected radicals nationwide. Bessie Smith was born in 1894, died in 1937, born in Chattanooga, one of the best singers during the 1920s, nicknamed the Empress of the Blues. Major influence of jazz, had many albums, has a Grammy Hall of Fame and a Grammy Lifetime Award. She had a contract with Columbia Records. She died by an automobile accident, regarded as the greatest female blues singer of the era. She started by singing in the streets. Before the Great Depression, she was the highest paid African American woman. At one point, made $2,000 in a week, struggled with alcohol, had her own private train, was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and she told the KKK to pick the sheets up and run. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president, born in 1872, died in 1933, nicknamed Silent Cal. He was born in Plymouth, was in favor of civil rights. He was president between the two world wars. He was raised on a family farm. He was very pro-business. He cut the amount of immigrants allowed into the U.S. He made the taxes less. He fought corruption. His first career was being a lawyer. He worked as a councilman, a solicitor, and a legislator, and mayor. He was unexpectedly chosen as vice president. He was very helpful during the Roaring 20s. Henry Ford was born in 1863 and died in 1947. He developed and manufactured the first automobile. He made the first Model T, which sold for $850. He was credited with Fordism, mass production of inexpensive goods. He was born in Wayne County, Michigan. He left his father's farm in 1879. He created the quadricycle, a carriage that didn't use any horses. He was big on innovations and known for hiring scientific researchers. He was the first man who completely controlled the biggest empire. He created the Model A. He was, at one point, he had his workers work for $7 a day. He invented the assembly line. He was an engineer, and he met Thomas Edison. In 1918, he ran for seat in Senate, and he is the founder of Ford. Louis Armstrong was born in 1901 and died in 1971. He was nicknamed Pops. He was one of the most influential figures in jazz. His career spanned 5 decades. He was a trumpeter, composer, singer, and actor. He was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was in a band. In Chicago and in New York, he did theater. Often he did other things instead of the blues. His manager was Joe Glazer. He was a good as band leader, singer, and comedian. He has 2 biographies. His wife helped jumpstart his solo career. At the age of 62, he surpassed and broke the top 10 at pop charts. The song What a Wonderful World was not a hit during his lifetime.